Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's virtual office hour on navigating the backbone role in collective impact. I am Jennifer Splansky-Juster, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum, a partnership between FSG and the Aspen Institute. We are so delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining. Before we dive into the Q&A for our office hour, I just want to spend a few minutes orienting you to today's session. We have about an hour together today. We're going to spend the first roughly half of our time answering some of the questions that many of you provided in your registration. We had over 100 questions come in, so we've done our best to lift up some themes that we saw across a number of different questions. Then we are going to open up to live Q&A, and by live I mean using the chat box on your screen. You can put questions in, and then our colleague will be curating those and sending them to me and my colleague, Melissa Umer, who's joining me today as well. So again, questions, you can use the question box that is part of the GoToWebinar app, and then we'll be looking through those and we'll get to the questions that you put in the second half of our time together. The session is being recorded, and we'll make the recording available in the next day or so. Keep an eye out for an email that has a link to the recording that we'll send out later. Let's see, we also have a handout that you can download, which is a copy of just a few slides that Melissa and I may reference during the course of our time together today. The webinar app has a handout section, and you can download that at any point during today's webinar. So we're going to keep this casual and conversational. Melissa and I are delighted to be with you today. And with that, let's go on to the next session. The next slide. So again, questions in the Q&A box. You can also use that if you have a technical question about if you can't hear us well or if there's a tech issue with the webinar platform. You can, as always, feel free to tweet or share what you are thinking about listening to this session on social media. Next slide. So before we dive in, I do want to more formally introduce my colleague, Melissa Umer, who's also joining me today. Melissa is a director with the nonprofit consulting group FSG, one of the hosts of the Collective Impact Forum. Melissa is a real leader in the collective impact field and has worked with a broad range of clients to help them launch, implement, and sustain their collective impact initiatives on a broad range of issues. She'll say a little bit more about the kind of work she's done as she's answering questions, I'm sure, but we're really lucky to have her joining us in the Collective Impact Forum team today. So before we take our first question here, just wanted to get a sense of who is on the line with us today. So go ahead and let us know in the poll that you now see on your screen. We know there are more than 5 roles probably that we could identify for the ways folks engage in collective impact. Please pick the one that most closely resembles the role that you're playing. Our webinar platform does not allow more than 5 options, so bear with us in that. All right, so I would say not surprising, the vast majority of folks on the line are funders, are backbones. Nearly 2/3 of you. We have almost 10% funders and a handful of you also representing partner organizations and or members of steering committees or working groups. And then about 20% of you identify in a different role, and we're glad to have all of you with us today. So with that, I'm going to turn to the list of questions that we pulled out from the questions we got during registration. And there were a lot of commonalities that we saw, and we've tried to lift those up into a set of a few questions to get us started. So for the first question, there were a lot of folks who were asking some of the questions around what are the basic roles that the backbone really should be playing in collective impact work. And then also, how does the backbone relate to other partners, be that the steering committee or working groups, or other structures that folks are coming together in the collaborative. So I have a couple slides that I thought would be helpful to share on this question. So let's go to the next slide. So one more. So we have some animation here, and our colleague Sharon is controlling the slides. You can bring up the whole slide, Sharon. So what you see here is that often in collective impact work, clearly none of this work is starting in a vacuum. All of you are in communities, in places where there are amazing organizations doing great work in the community. And often that work can be disconnected from much of the other relevant work that's happening, not a lot of coordination or referrals or learning happening, and in particular not across sectors. And so in collective impact, it's always helpful to think about what is that starting set of players in the ecosystem. And then as a collaborative comes together, often what we see happen in the early days is a leadership table or a steering committee comes together that's representative of a subset of those community partners, those little white circles on the screen. And then there is one person or a handful of folks that emerge as the right group to play the backbone role. And we'll talk just in a minute in much more detail, well, this whole session, about the role of the backbone. But the backbone often spends a lot of time in the early days facilitating conversations amongst the community and the steering committee to really identify the purpose and direction, vision, strategy for the collaborative to pursue overall. And so, Sharon, if you do one more click, what we often see is, and one more here, that on the left side we have the steering committee and with facilitation from the backbone, providing strategic guidance and support for the initiative overall. And then those arrows really represent communication that the backbone is helping to facilitate between the different elements of the collaborative. And so this is really how we think about distributed leadership across the collaborative. And as you can see, the backbone is often guiding and facilitating the process of the entire collaborative to come together, and specifically to the steering committee, often spending a lot of time with members of the steering committee, particularly in the early days, to design and form the common agenda for the work and to really facilitate the process forward. So on the next slide, we just have a little bit of really writing what I just voiced over. And again, you can download this for your reference. Just the role that these different unique elements of the overall governance and implementation structure of collective impact often looks like. So on the next slide, when we at the Collective Impact Forum and partners at FSG and others across the field have really taken a look at what are the core roles that the backbone tends to fulfill. There are 6 key functions that we see pretty consistently. There might be more, certainly, but we want to talk about these that we really do see consistently. So the first is guiding the vision and strategy of the collaborative. So I already begun to allude to this. So the backbone is not setting the vision and strategy, but they're guiding the range of partners to identify the common to share a common understanding of the problem and to set the vision and goals for what the work is what the partnership is really going to take on. In addition, they're supporting aligned activities. So once there is that high-level vision in place, really what is the work that's going to happen? And the backbone really is helping partners identify what that is, hosting, convening, facilitating meetings, and really bringing their strategic, big picture, kind of system-level strategic lens to that process of supporting activities across the collaborative. They're also really ensuring the collaborative is using data in its work, so that can be data early on to identify priorities, but also to help with continuous improvement over the course of an initiative. The backbone can and should be cultivating community engagement and ownership, advancing policy, and mobilizing resources. In some cases, it is the backbone team doing these things, like community engagement and policy work. And in other cases, it's the backbone identifying what partner organizations and priorities there are in that space and leveraging the expertise of partners in order to do that work. I just want to say a couple more things, then Melissa would love to have you add on here. Let me actually just go forward one more slide. So in addition to those roles, there in research that we've done, there are really some successful traits that many backbone leaders hold that enable them to pursue effectively this kind of role. So having credibility with folks that they are convening and folks in the community, serving as an honest broker or a convener of the conversation, again, not bringing all of the decisions or their own organization's perspective exclusively, but really facilitating the group process. The other couple that I'll just touch on this list are really holding a sense of urgency around the issue for the group to really keep folks motivated. And doing this all while staying, the last point here, behind the scenes. So lifting up partners and the work of partners and sharing credit across the group that is participating in the collaborative. So Melissa, is there anything that you want to add? I know we have lots of other questions, but I just wanted to pause there.
Yeah, two quick things. Hi, everyone. Glad to be with you today. I've helped a lot of organizations, collective impact efforts, hire backbones. And so the two things that I just wanted to add, and kind of on the practical side of that, is one, in that process, it's really important either before or right after a backbone staff is brought on board to really make explicit the various roles and responsibilities of the backbone versus the steering committee versus maybe co-chairs of a steering committee, to really make that clear, because otherwise there's a lot of assumptions that bubble up about who's doing what and who's leading on what. So I think just making that crystal clear in like a memorandum of understanding or some other document, governance document, is really helpful. And the second piece is, as you can imagine, after hearing Jen speak about all these different traits that you're looking for in a backbone and the different roles that they play, there's a lot of different ways that individuals can approach this role. So as you may be thinking about either hiring or finding additional staff, to really prioritize from these lists what's most important for your initiative given where it's at. So sometimes there might be trade-offs that you'll be seeing that someone's really good at X, but you also want Y. And so, you know, which one is more important for kind of the time being for the initiative? And again, to make that explicit about what you're prioritizing, since backbones have to wear lots of different hats and do lots of different things.
Thank you. Awesome. So the next set of questions that we saw a lot of interest in were around how the backbone can motivate and mobilize stakeholders and partners to take ownership and responsibility for achieving the shared goals. And how do we keep our partners, so that steering committee or the working groups or other partners, engaged and following through on these commitments? Melissa, you want to take a first stab at that one? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Yes, I was. Thank you. When I think about an effective backbone, I really think about them being servant leaders. So truly being a leader and guiding an effort while also helping to build up others' capabilities and lift others up as well. So if we go to slide 11, I just wanted to talk through a few highlights on this about the 6 sources of influence we see backbones, either as organizations and specifically the leaders of coalitions having. Next slide, sorry, Sharon. So first is just competence in the issue area that you may be addressing, as well as interpersonal skills to build relationships amongst folks in the community and on your different efforts. The second piece is a commitment. A lot of times we know that collective impact efforts are most likely really tackling complex issues that haven't been solved in the community before. So some track record of understanding the issue and really a dedication to solving it is important. The third one, I think, is actually the most important, which is being an honest broker. This is really being neutral. So, and it can often seem that someone has experience and passion for an issue that we're saying in number 2, committed to that issue. And at the same time, they still need to remain neutral and say, the choices that the group makes, I'm going to help them get there and make decisions, but I can't have skin in the game on which decision is better than the other. The fourth is being data-driven. So making sure that you may be neutral in terms of the decision, but you're still bringing up the most important data for the coalition to look at and evaluate. and bring their own experience to as well. The fifth is a network. So collective impact exists on relationships. And so if backbone staff come in with a strong network to connections in the community who care about this issue, who are needed to make change on this issue, that's really important. And the last is the ability to build visibility in the community. So this is making sure that they are visible in the community, they're building awareness, they're getting additional buy-in, and continuing to build that network along the way. So we see that these are sources of influence in ways that you might be, as a backbone, as many of you are on the line, balancing between these different things at different times, but at the same time balancing them all out. And so that's just how I think we, FSG and the Collective Impact Forum, think of backbone leaders kind of showing up and the traits that they have. To the specific question about how do you keep your partners engaged, this is something we get all the time. How do I keep my partners engaged? How do I maintain momentum? And there's a few pieces of guidance that I'd give on this piece. One is just making sure you have a lot of inclusion and involvement in the strategy setting process, in the common agenda setting process. So making the backbone, it can be a gatekeeper in the sense of deciding how big the tent is for determining the priorities. And the more folks you have involved in an authentic way, the more buy-in folks are going to have once that turns into implementation. The second piece I mentioned earlier, which is making sure that roles and responsibilities are clear. So this is not just up front as everyone's kind of understanding their place, but also when you get into that implementation and maintaining the momentum of the work, making sure it's clear, for example, that the steering committee is not just setting priorities, but they also play a role in implementing those priorities. The third thing I try to remind folks of is sometimes, a lot of times, collective impact work, there's a lot of meetings and discussion and getting into connections and building relationships. But sometimes the actual work, the strategies that you may use, aren't additional work. It's just realigning the system and using existing resources in new ways. And so reminding individuals that are participating of that and tapping their creativity on how that's possible is important. And so 4 quick tips of things I see in terms of what backbones can do. The first is to make sure that as you're always working that you're balancing short-term and long-term priorities, making sure that there's quick wins and things that the group can actually touch and feel the progress and momentum is really important. The second is using different techniques to make sure that it is a two-way street in terms of asking and offering for support from the coalition. So members who are participating in the steering committee or as community members or in working groups, they should be able to view it as they have things to offer that community and to put forth to advance the work, and they should be able to learn, make new connections, new partnerships as well. So making that very explicit is really important. I can't stress enough in terms of the importance of follow-up communication between meetings to maintain momentum. So make sure you tell folks via email what happened in a meeting, decisions that were made, who's responsible for next steps, and don't send that email just once. You have to send it quite a few times. And the last piece is to authentically ask for input along the way. Ask people to evaluate how things are going. Ask them if the meetings are a good use of their time, what they'd like to see changed. Another question I like to ask is how optimistic they are that the coalition is actually moving towards its goal and will make an impact on the issue that you all care about. And just take that real feedback, and if it's negative, then react to that. Ask what needs to change. If it's positive, good, keep on doing what you're doing. But I think giving folks an opportunity to give input is really important. Jen, what else would you add?
That was awesome. That was awesome. We had a somewhat related question that I think I'll ask and then take a stab at. So, so folks were asking somewhat relatedly, how do I balance the role of the backbone as guiding the work of the collaborative with actually doing work for the partners? I think this is really tricky. And I think actually a lot of the tips that Melissa just mentioned around how you can help hold people accountable to what they're signing up for and decisions that the group made, that those kind of techniques really help in getting folks to really own and help do a lot of the work that that the collaborative is doing. So I think there are certain things that it, of course, are the backbone's role to do. So when it comes to the collaborative process, like doing the work there is the role of the backbone. So planning meetings, of course with input from partners, but sort of owning the agenda development, the facilitation plan, often, curating data and bringing it to the conversation, really thinking about engaging folks in between meetings and brokering relationships and connections. That is the work of the backbone to be doing. I think there are other things where it's a little bit more gray, where, let's say that there's a work group that has some work that they say they want to be taking on, and as Melissa said, often that work is work that is not additive to folks' day job, but should be ways of doing current work differently, and encouraging people to recognize that is helpful. But, I think there are some cases where there can be some additional work, so additional research or preparing some documents to move something forward, or doing, like a communications campaign. I think that some of that, if it doesn't fall squarely in the purview of some of the partners, the backbone can be helpful in doing some of that work. But it always has to be a conversation, because if the expertise really resides in the partners that are at the table, to the extent you can use lots of the techniques Melissa was writing about, Melissa was speaking about, that can be a good strategy. I think that there are also backbones that I have seen that do take on some of the programmatic work that emerges as a result of the collaborative. So if there is something that is noticed in the system that none of the partners are doing, and it is something that needs to happen at a sort of a systemic level, the backbone might be the right organization or set of folks to take that on. So I'll just mention an example. There's a group, the LA Food Policy Council in Los Angeles, that talks about how they have, as a backbone, taken on some work that working groups have prioritized as being important, but because the Food Policy Council has that county-wide view and sort of system view, they were best positioned to take it on. And they have a process in place where the the steering committee is the group that actually decides whether that's work that should be taken on by partners or whether that's work that should be taken on by the backbone itself. And in identifying an opportunity for that's better served by the backbone, the steering committee has to approve that, and then there is additional funding that would come to the backbone to do that work. So it's not asking the backbone to take a new program off the side of its desk, but really taking it on behalf of the collaborative with additional funding to do that work, because they are most well positioned with that bird's eye view of the system to take it on. So I want to just paint the spectrum of different kinds of work and when it actually can be the right thing for a backbone to take on work versus, situations where you're doing work that really ought to be done by partners, and some of those tips that Melissa provided about trying to help people stay accountable for what they sign up for can be helpful. Melissa, let's transition to another question here. What does an effective backbone look like, and how do you think about evaluating the work of the backbone?
Yeah, so I think the backbone's a kind of theme of what I've been talking about can do a lot of different things. And another kind of challenge I hear from a lot of backbone leaders is, especially if they have a large steering committee, they have 30 bosses, right? And so there can be a lot of conflicting ideas of what success looks like for that backbone. So one thing I found really helpful is to get alignment from the steering committee, as well as, and especially kind of the co-chairs or executive committee, whoever you might have that's serving more of a leadership role on that committee, to agree to what does success look like for that backbone relative to the plans of the coalition. And so making that very clear that in the next 12 or 18 months, what are the milestones that we hope to see? What does success look like? And then really articulate what is the backbone's role in that. And checking in on that, every 3 to 6 months to see how is progress going. Have obstacles come up along the way that may be out of the control of the backbone. How do you modify? And so I think that has been really helpful to help the entire group set priorities, and for backbone leaders to not feel like they're having kind of whiplash all the time of well, there's this thing over here, and then there's this other thing, and where do I focus? And I'm getting evaluated by this whole big group, and lots of people have different priorities. So I think that's really helpful. Sharon, if we take a look at slide 14, there are some specific pieces here. Next slide, sorry, I'm skipping this one for now. There are some specific indicators along the kind of 6 functions of the backbone around what might success look like. These are pretty vague, so I would encourage folks to take these and say, what does this mean for our initiative or our coalition? And make sure that you're prioritizing some of these and then defining what they mean. So, for example, when you say partners accurately describe the common agenda, is that your steering committee? Is that getting it out to the whole community? How will you know if there's awareness of your common agenda? In terms of improving quality of work under aligned activities, knowing, is that at the work group level? So really making these pretty granular, so there's not a lot of room for interpretation of what success may or may not look like. And that I've seen has been very comforting to backbones and make them feel like they have a pretty concrete direction of where they're going, and pairing that with kind of feedback loops to check in along the way, knowing that the context may change, and so you can adjust it and adjust what the definition looks like. The other piece is, as backbones are being evaluated in terms of their job performance and their progress on the coalition's goals, it's really important to gather perceptions from all different types of stakeholders. It shouldn't just be the co-chairs or even just the steering committee. It should be getting input and feedback from all the various partners as you can that interact with the backbone to make sure it's a full view. On the previous slide, Sharon, if you just go back to 13, you can ask some questions around, how much is the backbone respected? How much are they providing support? And the answers may differ from the various levels of the structures that are involved with the coalition, and that's okay. They're all going to see a different kind of view of the backbone staff. I think the other 2 things in terms of effectiveness we've seen that might not be captured in those milestones or looking at the 6 functions is just stories. Some of those stories can be mapped back to the 6 functions and pictures of success, but how is the system shifting and changing? And these could be the way that relationships are changing, the way that mental models about, say, bias, implicit bias and things like that are shifting. But being able to capture some of those stories of when new connections were made and new things were happening as a result of the collaboration is really important to point to, especially in the early years. And the last piece, that's another kind of measure that you could look at, is leveraged funding. So is the coalition bringing in additional funding, growing its funding sources because other funders are recognizing the progress that the coalition is making?
That's great. I actually think that's a good transition to another set of questions that we got around generating funding for the backbone. So, as folks were asking about, are there particularly effective ways of persuading funders to invest in the backbone role? The Collective Impact Forum did a survey of the Collective Impact Forum network earlier this year. And we actually got about 250 responses to that survey asking how folks were funding their work as the backbone. So first I'll mention there's a blog on the Collective Impact Forum website that summarizes the findings from that survey. So that is a resource that many of you might find helpful. But I'll speak to a little bit about what we learned from that survey and what we've learned from the field while we're together now. So the first thing I would say is that when you're talking about fundraising for the backbone role and for collective impact work in general, I think there's always a balance in how much you talk about the collective and how much you talk about the impact. And by that, I mean some of us in our fundraising conversations are much more inclined to talk about what I would say is the collective. So the process, bringing people together, building relationships, all of what many of you playing the backbone are spending a lot of your time doing, and what is often really unique about the collective impact work. So often folks will talk a lot about the collective, and there are some funders that are really attracted to that and really attracted to building capacity and really thinking about changing relationships in the system. And then there are some funders that really don't care a lot about the collective, but they really care about the impact, right? And they want to know, how is this, how is this work contributing to impact? What are you seeing in terms of changes in the system, changes in policy, changes in population level? What kind of impact are some of the programs that the collaborative is supporting accomplishing? And so being able to have a sense of what interests the funders you're speaking with, one or the other or both, and kind of leaning in on either making the case around the collective or making the case around the impact can be useful. So that's just kind of a big picture framing piece that I want to share with respect to the fundraising. I think, Sharon, if you go forward 2 slides, I think it is, there were some themes that really emerged in the survey of the field about what people are using as successful messages and approaches in their fundraising for the backbone role. So the first was folks are finding it helpful to be really specific in messaging how the backbone is impacting partner success. So a lot of what Melissa was just talking about, how can you point to the value add specifically of the backbone, and how they are helping really improve the impact of a really broad set of partners and resources. You can use your partners to help you communicate that. You can use feedback that you get in surveys or evaluations from your partner in helping to make that case. But really being crisp about the role that the backbone is playing in supporting the initiative. So I think the second thing that I would mention is that here it says thoughtfulness about how and when to communicate with funders. So I think what this is really intending to say is that there are a lot of benefits to engaging funders early in the process and getting them invested in the collaborative and the work. And so if you can engage some of your funders early so that they are part of the co-creation process and feel co-ownership of the initiative, that can really contribute to their support of the work, not only the program, the work that comes out of the collaborative, but seeing the key role that the backbone plays in the work. So targeted message based on funder interest and alignment. So 2 things. Part of this is understanding if you're really trying to make the case around the collaborative infrastructure or the impact, sort of what is that social or environmental issue that you're pursuing. And then, of course, this is kind of fundraising 101, but understanding the interests of the funder and how your work will contribute to their goal, right? So if it's an early childhood funder and you're working on a large education initiative, like really focusing on how this work is going to advance the early childhood outcomes that they care so much about. The fourth point here, the ability to track and communicate progress at every stage of the initiative. So Melissa showed a slide that had some big picture learning questions around the role of the backbone. That was from a broader guide to evaluating collective impact. So I know some folks have been asking questions about evaluating collective impact in the chat box. I would point to the guide to evaluating collective impact as a great resource, as well as a study that was published last year called When Collective Impact Has an Impact, which was actually a research study of the impact of collective impact initiatives. And these both have very helpful appendices that have a lot of guidance on how to evaluate the collective impact work that you're doing. And the reason I mention that here is because the Guide to Evaluating Collective Impact has a framework that suggests there are different kinds of impact that you can expect to see at different points in time. So in the early days, you would expect to see more more change around the health of the collaborative, the relationships that are forming, the capacity that's being built of the partners, so that collective piece. In the middle stage, you would start seeing system changes, and you would start being able to hopefully have some evidence around the collaborative contribution to system change. And then, of course, you would always want to be keeping an eye on the long-term population level impact. What kind of changes in lives are we seeing as a result of this work? But that can take a long time. This is a lot of you are working on generational challenges and generational opportunities, and so it can take a long time to see change at a population level. So being able to point to progress at different stages, whether that's progress of the collaborative, progress on some of the system changes that hopefully will then contribute to progress at a population level, knowing sort of where you are and what kind of evidence you can bring to make the case for the progress of the collaborative is helpful. So that you're looking for progress at the right stage when you are thinking about how to make your case and communicate the value of the collaborative to funders. So it also goes, just to underscore the importance of having data and learning and evaluation woven in so that you can have some of that story to tell to funders. The last point on the page here, before we move to the next question, is, as we've talked about, there are different roles that the backbone plays, and different funders might be interested in funding a subset of that work. So some funders might be very excited about funding the data work of the collaborative, maybe investing in building the capacity of partners around data collection and analysis, and having that as, and funding the backbone to do some of that capacity building, maybe funding a data system for the collaborative to use. So you could imagine some funders might be interested in that, or there might be funders that are interested in funding policy or advocacy type work, or mobile, community movement building or mobilization work that the backbone is really working on. And so thinking about parsing out the different roles of the backbone, there might be some funders that are interested in funding specific pieces of the backbone's work. The last thing I will say, and again, all the survey findings are on a blog on the Collective Impact Forum website, but we thought that it was interesting that philanthropy accounted for was the largest source of funding for the backbones that answered the survey. But a large share of backbones were seeing significant amounts of their funding come from the public sector as well. So, public sector funding streams flowing towards the backbone is another way that backbones are getting funding for some of their work in the collective impact work. So what I was talking about is more relevant for philanthropic fundraising, but there are multiple sources of funding that backbones can tap into. One more question we got that I just want to touch on briefly is folks are asking, how do partners and funders best support the backbone? And a couple things I would just quickly say here, although I'm sure backbones on the line have lots of ideas and suggestions, but based on what we've heard, in conversations with lots of folks in the field, I think there are things folks can do from a funding perspective and a non-funding perspective. From a funding perspective, first and foremost, make long-term grants. This is work that takes a while and is really, really hard to do if a backbone is getting funded for 1 year at a time. So to the extent grants can be long-term to support the backbone work, that is incredibly, incredibly supportive and helpful. And so funding the infrastructure of the backbone, funding some of those functions around data, funding community engagement work, and enabling some of that funding to go to things like stipends for community members or working group chairs, or stipending people that are participating as residents, not as part of their day job. Funding for really the process the backbone really needs to have the space to successfully accomplish. I think, and of course, in addition to funding, there are a lot of non-funding things partners and funders can do. So we were already talking about following through on commitments that you make and really helping the backbone in doing the work of moving the agenda forward. Using credibility and connections to leverage new resources, to be a champion to bring other people into the collaborative, and really taking a leadership role on behalf of the community. on behalf of the initiative in the community. Checking in on the backbone and helping make space for the folks playing the backbone role to attend to their own self-care, I think is something that often goes unrecognized. The backbone role is very hard and can be very lonely work. And so to the extent that you can be a supportive colleague and peer, that can be really, really, really valuable. So, Melissa, I don't know if you want to add anything there. If not, we can certainly turn to more questions.
Yeah, I was just looking at the questions to see which ones also asked about funding while we're on this topic, and there was one about, are there examples of successful backbones who also provide direct funding to some partners? And so I'm curious to know what you've seen here, Jen. I have 2 examples where this has not gone well, so I don't have a success story to share, but kind of some words of caution or things I've seen them do to try to undo some of the bad outcomes they saw by mixing the funding with kind of the work of coordination. So I think the first thing is just drawing bright lines between who is involved in the coalition in terms of setting the direction and the strategy, say on the steering committee, and then who's making decisions on funding. And it can't be the same people, and there can't be folks involved there that then can benefit from the funding. Because if they're making decisions and setting the direction, and then they're a nonprofit or a local agency who's getting some of that funding, that obviously looks really bad and doesn't seem like the coalition is acting in the best interest of the community. So I think just making sure there's kind of walls there and checks and balances is really important, and it's not an afterthought, but super intentional from the beginning. I think the other piece is if the coalition is going to be doing some kind of re-granting, is to think about experimenting with very inclusive grant-making processes and even participatory grant-making to kind of give money back to the communities that it serves and ask communities directly how they want to use the money and actually put them in charge of the re-granting. That can be seen as much more authentic than kind of the usual power brokers, if you will, who might be at the steering committee table, again, making all the decisions. So those are just 2 things I've seen that when this has gone poorly, things put in place to try to get it back on track. And I don't know, Jen, if you've seen other things or seen folks who have been successful at this.
No, I was thinking of very, very similar sort of cautions and the advice on how to navigate that. Yeah, I agree. And that there are, just responding to another related question, like there are certainly funders that we see playing the backbone role. And so it's not unusual to see like a local foundation, a community foundation, a United Way serving as the backbone. But as Melissa said, ideally you can sort of have like a firewall, if you will, between the staff that is making funding decisions and the staff that is the facilitator, and so that the funder, like the umbrella organization, is an equal voice on the steering committee to all of the other partners, and it doesn't become an initiative of that funder. So there are benefits to funders playing their role too, in that funders often can bring credibility and can bring connections and can bring financial stability to the backbone. So lots of successful examples too, but you have to kind of tread carefully for sure.
Yeah.
I have a question here about, could you share more about how to talk about impact without taking credit away from partners? Do you want to take that, Melissa, or do you want me to?
Why don't you start? Let me think about it for a minute.
Sure. So I think one of the things that I'm thinking some very specific backbone leaders do an awesome job of is having the partners speak about the success of the collaborative. So it doesn't have to be the person who is playing the backbone role that is the voice of the success story. So one backbone leader I'm thinking of, whenever she gets a press inquiry, she doesn't answer it herself. She asks for a volunteer from the steering committee to speak on behalf of the collaborative. Another way you can think about that is in fundraising meetings, bringing a partner with you so that it's not only the backbone's voice, but it is the voice of partnership coming forward to talk about the work. And so I think many of you do this as second nature. As you're talking about the work of the collaborative, you're talking about who all the partners are and who's actually contributing to the progress. But those are some very kind of tangible and tactical ideas for doing so. Let's see. I'm just scrolling through a couple more questions here.
And I was going to take the one about the work groups, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Which was how much guidance should the backbone be offering? How much information and research should the backbone feed the working groups, especially during the first few meetings? So I think there's something implied here about how important the work groups are to drive the momentum forward and to get into some tangible strategies. And so, and I know that the tension here is backbone staff have limited time and they can't prepare at the same level of detail for every meeting. So my advice usually here is to think about just what's the conversation that needs to be had. And if there is some data that needs to be kind of serving as the foundation for that conversation, how can you, A, ask partners to bring and present some of that information, but B, I think even more importantly, how can you use the perspectives in the room to kind of generate that information and have a conversation about it? So working group meetings shouldn't be about presenting and just having people hear information, but more having maybe some data, as I said, as a foundation, and then having really good dialogue about why that's true for some people or not true. And so we often see using some of the system mapping tools, and so I think it's a system change toolkit that we have. We can provide a link of doing things like actor mapping and different process mapping in the system to say, you know, most of the time people just see their one slice of the system. And so how do you as the backbone get that conversation started to say, really think about what's the conversation that hasn't happened before, and not by having these cross-sector actors together in a room, you can have a really different type of conversation and rely on the power of the knowledge in the room to service the data rather than you having to collect it all in advance and package it beautifully. Jen, what else would you add?
Yeah, that's great. I may have spoken to this already in talking about evaluation in making the case for the backbone and for fundraising, but someone asked, we often get asked about how to support measuring impact by our partners. Are there any universal trends in measurement and evaluation, like how to measure impact of a collective impact network or what things an org should be measuring? So again, I would point to the guide for evaluating collective impact as a great tool. There's an appendix with a range of evaluation questions and potential indicators that could be considered. And again, I think it's important to start by asking yourself, are you talking about measuring the health and progress of the collaborative formation, the kinds of system changes that you're pursuing, and there's a body of research in the field around measuring systems change, whether that's policy change or resource flows or changes in power or shifting mental models. You know, there is a body of research around evaluating systems change. And then, again, population change. I think, yeah, and that's what many of us may think is more traditional kind of evaluation. You know, what are we evaluating about the impact overall that we are having? I think when resources are available, collaborative can benefit from hiring third-party evaluators. And there are also a lot of collaboratives that have data partners built in that help with bringing data in real time into conversations. But that is distinct from evaluation that is taking the bigger picture look at what is the contribution that our work is making and uniquely, or the contribution or attribution to the work of the collaborative. Melissa, would you add anything to that?
No, I think you covered most of it. Nothing else big.
Okay. Okay, here's a question. What are structured ways to guard against partners from using the steering committee time to vie for funding from funders in the room? For example, are there examples of efforts that have separate committees or groups for funders than members? You want to take that?
Yeah. So I think the two things I would point to here is just how you're structuring the meetings. So I think if you're focusing the meeting on what's the topic or problem the steering committee is grappling with, hopefully the meeting content is going to be so focused that there won't be kind of time for folks to behave in this way, I guess. I think there's another piece of so 3 pieces, I guess. In addition to that, maybe just some ground rules about, we often say when folks are coming into a collective impact meeting that you kind of have to check your ego at the door. So there could be something like that about, you're coming in here to really advance the work of this coalition, and while you represent a really important perspective from the community, and that's why you're here, we're hoping that you're thinking about the greater good while you're in this room. So sometimes it's good to have some kind of rules of engagement. And on the specific question about specific committees for funders, I have seen that, and I haven't seen a movement towards like a funder or a philanthropic committee because of the fact that they feel pressured by people around the table for funding, but more because to make space for other perspectives around the steering committee table. So if you're trying to limit it to 20 or 25 individuals and you have 6 or 8 funders in the community saying, okay, can we have one slot for funders? You all will have a funders committee where you can meet and discuss this, and the one person who's on the steering committee can update you. But really to know that you don't want to have an outsized kind of weight of voices of funders in the room, so that you can make sure you're making space for other nonprofits and community members, et cetera.
Yeah, great. Another question here. Do you define your project structure and the roles of each actor in the project before forming a steering committee or after? Or should we form the committee and they will help us define the structure and roles? You want to take that and then I can add?
Sure. Yeah, so I think best practices that you would have the steering committee helping to form the structures and roles, et cetera, again, to make it as participatory as possible, that it's not something that's being done to people, but they're coming to the table and they're having a say. Obviously, that takes a lot more time because you're weighing 20 or 30 individuals and bringing them through the process. But our perspective typically is that by bringing them through the process, that makes the buy-in greater and makes the success of implementation more likely. And so I think you can bring in, if there's already been some work done, some thinking, strategic planning, different community needs assessments, bringing that all in for the steering committee to kind of wade through, if you will, but that it's important for everyone to look at the data from their various perspectives and come to conclusions together.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is that we often would encourage you to not think about the structure and roles as fixed in time and that they may evolve over time. So that could be evolution in what kinds of perspectives you want present on the steering committee based on how the work evolves over time. Evolution of what those working groups are. You might start with 2, 3, 4 work groups, but that's what you think at this point in time, and being really having a lens towards learning and sensing where the energy and opportunities are really means that the structure and governance can and should evolve over time. So, in addition to your best shot from the get-go, being open to change over time can be really useful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any recommendations about tech platforms to establish better two-way communication with statewide collaboratives where physical presence is not always possible? I'll share a few thoughts. None of them are endorsements of specific products, but I think there are different kinds of tech products that can help. So there are, I think this might be stating the obvious, but to the extent you can do video conferencing as opposed to phone calls, that really goes a long way. Platforms like Zoom also enable you to break out into breakout groups on the same video conference and come back together. And so just as you would run a good meeting in person by having some time in a big group and some time in small group discussions of a platform, a tech product that can be really helpful. There might be others that do that too. That's just the one that I am most familiar with. So there's sort of the video conferencing meeting capabilities. And then I'm not sure what you're asking about that versus something like a shared workspace online. Lots of folks, frankly, use like Google Drive products that are free or very low cost. There are also more sophisticated products like Basecamp, where they're more collaborative project management software that folks use. So I think there's a real need in collective impact to build relationships and rapport amongst participants. So if you can think about doing that, virtually through how you facilitate the meetings and using video and giving groups big and large, small group opportunities to connect in addition to the full group, that can be helpful. Melissa, are you scanning the questions too? I think we have time for one or two more.
Yeah.
Any recommendations for backbones on how to illustrate the full breadth and time and effort of the work they are carrying out, especially to partners who are sporadically involved and active in the effort? I think we mentioned earlier trying to actually get feedback from partners that are in the collaborative about the role of the backbone at various points in time can be useful feedback for the backbone, but you can also then share that back with the steering committee, with other partners to say, here's what, and it takes some vulnerability probably, but you can say, here's where people are seeing us add value for this collaborative. And so it's not you making the case, but you're using the input of partners in the collaborative to make the case. I would also say using your partners, whether, either your members of the steering committee who are more active or other influential voices to be your advocate to make the case for you can be really useful. So trying to lean into others to help you with that. What else comes to mind for you, Melissa?
I think for me, it's just constantly making sure that you are tracking and communicating just what you're doing and the small wins along the way. I think sometimes folks might lose, they're only thinking about the big goal, and they're not necessarily thinking about all those small steps that backbones have to take along the way. And so I've seen it be really successful in meetings when a backbone leader every month or every quarter, however often you meet with your steering committee or work group, for you to report out like what's been going on in the last month. And it might be that you attended a conference and met these people, or you presented on the coalition's work and you got this input or feedback. Anything that even it might appear more process-oriented, really noting that and then connecting it back to why it's important to the work is really important. And sometimes when I'm speaking with backbones, they don't even see it because it's just everything that they're doing. And so it's hard to articulate if you're not being intentional about tracking those things along the way.
Great, great. So I think in the interest of time, that will be our last question for today. I did want to point everyone to a few resources that you might find helpful, either for yourself and questions that you have, but also I think there were some questions that either directly or indirectly asked how to make the case for this work to others in your community. And there might be some resources that might be useful in doing so. So first I'll mention, most of you may have been to collectiveimpactforum.org. There is a Getting Started page. It's one of the tabs on the big banner. There are a lot of resources there that can help you make the case and explain collective impact as an idea and explain the backbone to folks in your community. So I would point you to all the resources that are there. If we move forward a couple slides, I have a resource list here. So first, let me actually just mention, we have, this is just a subset of many more videos that we have of backbone leaders themselves talking about their work. And these four, and there are many others actually also on the website, are way better than me and Melissa making the case for the work that they're doing, and I think can be really helpful and inspirational. And if you watch these, I think that it would be a really meaningful use of your time. They're in the video. If you go to the Collective Impact Forum Library Resources section and select videos and thumb through, you will find them. Then on the next slide, and again, this is available for download and we'll send a link later, this is a list of a subset of the resources on the role of the backbone that folks might find useful. So you can check these all out on your own time for sure. So lots more on the Collective Impact Forum website too, as well as other resources. Other websites that have great resources are the Tamarack Institute. FSG's website has quite a few, and there are other resources, other collective impact resources that we can point to from the website as well. So with that, I think that we will just thank you all for joining today. We will circulate a recording after, as well as a survey. This is our first experiment doing a virtual office hour, so we really do welcome your input and your feedback so we can make the most of our time together. So thank you again, and have a great day.